Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. Or maybe I should say it the way Patrick says, recover you. Recover you.
I have the wrong emphasis somewhere?
No, it's not necessarily wrong. You've just made fun of mine. So now
okay. I got you.
Recover you. Hi.
Hi.
So today's podcast episode is about forgiveness. I would encourage you to check out our original podcast on forgiveness, which I believe, and I could totally be wrong here. Let me pull it up really fast. I think it's episode 17. So if it's around that, it's the first year. And the reason that's kind of in my mind is because we also did a forgiveness meditation around that time as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's around episode 17, but check that out. We talk about, 17 is talking to your kids after discovery. Also very important.
Yes. Yeah. Please forgive us for not having this figured out before
ahead of time. Okay, it's episode 33, and the episode right after that is the forgiveness meditation. So definitely check out episode 33, Forgiveness After Sex Addiction and Betrayal. But today, we're going to talk about a little bit more, and this was inspired by a conversation I had with a client recently, and I just want to start this conversation by saying that this is a hot topic. It's a difficult topic. It's one of the primary things that betrayed partners struggle with. And the reason I think that is, we're going to go into a couple things that I think might hinder forgiveness. We'll kind of break those down today. But I think one of the reasons that this is such a tough topic is because everybody has like their own definition about what forgiveness is and how they view it. And I think it sometimes complicates the idea in a way that makes it difficult for us to actually feel like we've done it, if that makes sense. And we'll kind of talk about that in some of the points that I'm going to make here about like what might get in our way of actually forgiving someone. But yeah, I thought I would just sort of blanket statement that we know that this is really hard. And I also kind of want to say what we share in this, like you might have a totally different perspective on it. That's okay. This is one of those things that I don't necessarily know that there is a one size fits all for, and that's okay too. So in the original episode where we talked about forgiveness, we were talking a lot about like what it is and what it's not. So maybe that would kind of be helpful to go through as well. But we're going to break down a couple things that I think may actually keep us stuck or make it really, really difficult for us to forgive, because this is something I think a lot of people struggle with. So that being said, knowing that people, I think personally, have a lot of different associations with, beliefs around, or definitions of forgiveness, how would you personally define forgiveness, Patrick?
I think, me personally, I believe forgiveness is for the hurt and for the person who has been hurt. And so when the person offers that degree of forgiveness for whatever that hurt may be, it's an important emotional step for the hurt person to release bitterness, maybe some anger, whatever that may be. I think this is just my personal opinion. I think it's more for the person who's been hurt than the hurter, the hurterer. While it's nice to hear that if you've been the perpetrator, it still means that there's work to do, right? It doesn't mean that it's just, okay, all is forgotten. Mm-hmm. But I really do believe that it's an emotional moment. And I was actually listening to a podcast this morning about somebody who went to jail, and the spouse actually, it was actually a hitman type thing. And so the spouse forgave this ex-spouse who was trying to, get them killed. Wow. And it was basically because he said, I didn't want to carry that bitterness in my life. Mm-hmm. He didn't want her out of prison. You know what I mean? That's a good point. Yeah, he didn't want her out of prison. He just mm-hmm. knew that if he held on to that bitterness and that emotional stuckness, that he could not move forward with his life and be able to find meaning again. And so I think in my mind, I think 80-20, 75-25, whatever it would be. I think it really is for the person who's been hurt.
So I view it as there's two types of forgiveness. One is one that you offer to the person that's hurt you, and one is more what you were just talking about, which is really between you and God. That is a release of the bitterness, a release of the anger. And the way you just described it is a great way of saying maybe it is actually letting go of the right to get revenge.
Yeah.
So that's actually an interesting way to think about it, because I think on the betrayed side, one of the reasons we might want to hold on to it is because it gives us a right, in a sense, to punish the partner for what they've done to us. So I think based on sort of the story that you just shared and that thought, forgiveness might even just be a release of a letting go of revenge. In a sense.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
It's like, because it's really like, if you ask yourself the question, what can this person do to fix or repay me for the pain they've caused me? The answer really is nothing. So it's you almost think about that in a spiritual sense, right? It's forgiveness is offering someone a gift that they don't really deserve, because the alternative, what you were saying, is us really holding on to something that doesn't serve us. It really ends up hurting us. So I think that's actually a really interesting, we didn't really plan that. You didn't share your definition with me or that story before we started.
Right.
But I think the concept of it being a release of the right to have revenge on someone, I think is a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that. So the first thing that might hinder forgiveness, again, I said I believe that there's two types, right? The type between you and God, like it's a spiritual level, sort of like what we just talked about, maybe the right to have revenge on someone, or like the right to punish them yourself, to enact that, whatever. And you're sort of releasing that and giving it to God and saying, like, I don't want to feel these difficult, painful, I don't want it to turn into long-term bitterness and negative emotions kind of stuck in my body, right? Because then at that point, to what you were saying, that ends up hurting the betrayed partner more in the end. But then there's the other type of forgiveness where you offer it voluntarily to the person who has hurt you. And there's some situations where that's very powerful, and some situations where that's totally not necessary, and some situations where it may not even be appropriate. So for example, the first thing that might hinder forgiveness is the person who hurt you still hurting you?
Right.
Are they still actively hurting you? Because in order to offer a human being forgiveness from another human being, the actual act of violence or wounding or betrayal or whatever has to be done. Like, it has to be in the past. In order to offer forgiveness, you can't be in the middle of it.
Right.
So that's a good thing to maybe ask is the hurt, not the, I shouldn't say the hurt, because the pain, the grief, the anger, those things continue.
The behavior.
Is the behavior that actually caused the wound, is that done?
Right.
Because if they are continuing to gaslight, to blame, to cheat, to look at porn, whatever it is in your situation, you are, in my belief system, you are not ever required to offer another human being forgiveness when they are actively hurting you. Which is one of the reasons that sometimes the church gets it wrong when a couple comes into, quote unquote, biblical counseling or pastoral counseling or whatever, and they don't offer actual healing resources. They just tell the betrayed partner, well, you need to forgive. And that the reason that's so harmful is because the act of betrayal hasn't necessarily stopped.
Right.
Like what are you going to do? Like, my forgiveness doesn't make him be in recovery.
Yeah. He still has to do the hard work.
Yeah. And like, it's not really the place until that's done for me to actually offer forgiveness at all. I'm actively hurting. So that's different, or actively being hurt. So that's the first thing I think that can get in the way is it the right time? If it's not the right time, don't pressure yourself.
Right.
Again, kind of going back to the scenario that we just said, a lot of people are pressured to forgive too quickly. And there was some research done that actually showed that women who feel required or prompted or pushed or whatever, or force themselves to forgive before they're actually ready, they actually end up sicker, like physically sicker.
Yeah.
Because what happens? it ends up stuck in the body because it's not processed.
That's
and
right.
it's actually physically, mentally, and spiritually unhealthy to do so. So if that is the case, don't rush yourself. And that goes into a lot of what we've talked about in other episodes of the podcast, where it's like believing the actions, not just the words. So you have words plus action plus consistency over time. That's going to build trust, and then you're going to feel safer, and then it'll feel more natural. Now, I quote unquote forgave you super fast.
Mm-hmm.
That for me wasn't necessarily difficult, because I think maybe I should bring that up in a little bit, because I separate it in a way that I think sometimes it might be tricky. Like I said, everybody has their own definition of what that means, right? So for me, that in no way took away from what I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew that you were for real sorry.
Yeah.
And that you didn't mean to hurt me, right? Like I could see that you were in pain.
Mhm.
And so for me, those words coming out of my mouth, that didn't, it's different. Different things are hard for different people, right? Intimacy and starting physical intimacy after betrayal is going to be easier for some and harder for some. Saying the words, I forgive you, is going to be easier for some and harder for some.
Mhm.
Getting past anger is going to be easier for some and harder for some. Getting past grief is going to be easier for some, right? So I think that's not like, oh, look at me, I forgave you, Dave. There were other things that we've shared on the podcast that stuck around for a long time for me, and other people
Mhm.
not so much, right?
Yeah.
So everybody in this is different. There's not necessarily a right or wrong. However, I had the impression that you were really devastated by this. So for whatever reason, I felt like I could offer that to you right away, but that didn't.
What's interesting, and you asked me this right before, you said, hey, how did that feel, or what exactly? I forget.
Yeah, like what did it mean to you, or how did it make you feel?
And I was like, man, I don't remember that. And I think part of, I remember it, but not really remember it. And like, I don't remember. And I think part of it's because I was not ready to forgive myself at all.
Right.
And so hearing that, while it was nice in that moment, it didn't, in my mind, erase anything. You know what I mean? And so like, I think it was just, and I was not ready. I felt like I was the biggest piece of crap ever,
So what you just said is really interesting. So when we have we all have life experiences, and we all have different pain. And what all of those things, what our history does, our life experiences create a filter that we view our life through. What's fascinating about those filters, everybody's is a little different, is it can literally delete things.
Mm-hmm.
So and sometimes it can be like incredibly powerful. So like if somebody is talking to you, it might delete words.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might completely interpret what they're doing or what they're saying or doing in a different way than what they intend or what they're saying.
Right.
And so that's really interesting, because you kind of just said you deleted the forgiveness when I was offering that to you, because your filter was set that you didn't deserve it. So you weren't receiving it.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting. And we can do that too on the betrayed side. If our filter is really in the pain and the wounding and some negative beliefs and things like that, we may not see, hear, or accept some of the recovery that our spouse is doing. And so that could be on both sides.
Right.
So the number one thing that's going to hinder forgiveness is obviously if you're still in the thick of it. So if that's you, don't feel any pressure like, oh, I'm a bad person, or I'm doing the wrong thing, or there's something wrong with me that I haven't forgiven. You have to be, I believe, at least somewhat separated from it. Although, I guess I'm being a little bit of a hypocrite because I offered it to you right away. But you weren't, I also was like,
it's very situational.
But I was also at the same time like, okay, but you're never going to do this again. And if you do, I'm out. Right. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. So maybe that's a little bit of a
I think
counter. Maybe I just countered myself. I don't know.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason. But if you're struggling with it and you feel like maybe that's part of the reason why, like they're still actively hurting you,
mm-hmm.
then that makes sense to me. Like you can be separated from it, and that's okay. Give yourself some time and don't feel pressured. And I didn't feel pressured.
Mm-mm.
Like that. I certainly did not feel pressured. Okay. So the second thing that can really hinder forgiveness is if we struggle with empathy as the betrayed partner. Now in this podcast, we talk a lot about empathy from the person who hurt you, the person who has the addiction, and having empathy on the trauma of the betrayed partner. But we also, every human needs to work on empathy, right? And so certainly we as the betrayed partner need to learn compassion, empathy as well. if that's not something that we're already tapped into, and again, everybody's different. Some people are really good at different things and some people struggle with different things, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just we all have different strengths in different areas, and that's okay. But if we struggle with compassion or empathy, then it would make forgiving someone very difficult. And I think the reason that is because I believe that forgiveness is really directly correlated to our ability to see the duality and spectrum of color in a situation. Mm-hmm. So the idea that someone can be a good person and do a bad thing, if that is a difficult concept, or if that is something we've never really thought about, or that's something we aren't readily willing to kind of believe, then forgiveness might be really, really hard, because the alternative is, well, they're just a bad person, so how can I forgive them?
Yeah, and I think the level of empathy that you can display is directly proportional to the level of healing you are in. And so I think as you grow in that, like if you, the very first moment of betrayal, and it's not always the case, but I think you come hardwired with some empathy. Some levels of empathy, some are more, some are less. But as you move through your own wounding and heal that wounding, I think your ability to become more empathetic is one of the positive side effects of the healing journey.
I think that goes back to the first one that we were talking about, which is, do you feel like safety and stability has actually been created in your environment? So that's the priority. And if that hasn't happened, if you aren't if you don't feel like you're on the same page with your partner, if you're not feeling respected by your partner, if you're not feeling safe, like their behavior has changed, then having empathy and compassion on something that they did that was bad is going to be really difficult, I would think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it plays into, like, do you feel safe? Is the behavior that hurt you in the past? And are you seeing changes in behavior that gives you the ability to say, they are changing, they are respecting my boundaries, I feel safe, I feel loved. And then through that lens, I can see this is a really good person that did a bad thing. And that's a little bit easier for me to swallow and digest than if I'm like living in the thick of it. I'm getting like discovery after discovery after discovery. They're not really empathetic. They're not respecting my boundaries. They're not, those types of things. And again, always being careful, like, what is our filter? So if we struggle with what you were saying, is it's directly correlated to healing. So are we doing the self-reflecting and the healing work on our side to make sure that as much as possible we are experiencing and seeing the reality of today, what's actually happening today? Because that can be hard too. Absolutely. when you're in trauma brain. Right. So the first thing is, if you're kind of in the midst of it, in the middle of being hurt. The second thing is lack of empathy. Again, that ability to see the duality in a situation. I think that can be tricky sometimes. I think it's just easier, right? Like, as humans, we want things to be simple. As humans, we want to put things into categories. Like, oh, you go into this category, you go into this category. And you just see, like, throughout life, like, that's just not reality, right? You see it in politics right now. It's like people so desperately want to categorize into like red or blue.
Right.
And it's like most people, I think, aren't really maybe that definitive.
Yeah, you can agree with one thing, but also say, hey, I'm going to vote this way. Or you can, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, it's a very interesting, but there's a desire, I think, in culture and in our world to really put people in categories. And I think we have to be really careful with that, because if you go to the extreme, right, you're going to have racism. You're going to have putting people into buckets, that define people's categories. Thank you. And I think that's like really, we have to be so careful about that, because people are so nuanced. And there's so much that makes a person. And there's so much that goes into like why someone responds a certain way. Just like we carry our baggage with us, and then it creates the way we view a situation, they carry their baggage with them as well. And then they respond to how you respond, and vice versa, right? And so when you have two wounded people that are activating each other's woundings, that's really hard.
Yeah.
Really, really hard. And I do think one of the things that really helped us continue to navigate was like we both were wanting to learn about trauma and about recovery, and then do different forms of brain work and subconscious work.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows you to have a little bit more empathy for the other person, as well as sort of cutting the cord to the baggage that you're carrying so that you can be a little bit more in the present.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's so helpful. And I also see situations where only one partner is doing that, and that still makes it incredibly hard.
Yeah.
It's like if two people can do the work to understand the other,
Mm-hmm.
and to offer empathy and to deal with the baggage that they're sort of carrying into the conversations and the patterns that they're having,
Right.
that's going to be a lot easier to navigate than if only one person is trying to do that, because that ends up being incredibly heavy and difficult.
Yeah.
So this kind of goes into it a little bit. The third one is negative beliefs around what forgiveness actually means. I would say this for a lot of people might actually be one of the main things that makes it hard to forgive,
Mm-hmm.
is this idea that if I forgive, it means XYZ.
Right.
And so that's a lot of conscious or maybe subconscious beliefs based on how you were raised in church, how you were raised in your family, what your personal definition of forgiveness is.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the most common ones might be something like, well, if I say I forgive you, it means I can't ever bring it up again.
Yeah. Which is not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if I forgive you, it means that my pain is no longer validated.
Right.
Right. Like somehow if I release you with forgiveness, it means that I don't get the care and the support and the healing that I need.
Or for the addicted, if you are forgiven, then it means that we don't need to do any more work, and then it's all okay.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, you got to keep going. You absolutely got to keep going.
Not to bring up the same example, but sometimes when a couple is told, well, you just need to forgive each other and move on. He's confessed. He said he's sorry. That's it. Then it tells the spouse forgiveness means you move on, and it tells the person that's done the wounding forgiveness means you move on and you don't have to do any work.
Process done.
It's done. She forgave you. It's all good. And you guys should just go back together. There's nothing, existing like trauma or anything like that, pain.
Yeah.
It just forgiveness covers all the wounds like
That's
magic.
right.
And it's like that. I'm sorry, but trauma doesn't work that way.
Right.
So I think it might be really valuable to go, well, how do I think about forgiveness?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's my personal definition of forgiveness? What does it actually mean to me? If I forgive, is there something I think that takes away from me?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something I think it means I'm not allowed to do after this? Is there something I think that if I forgive my partner, does that mean he got away with something?
Right.
Ooh, that's a big one, I think.
Yeah.
If I say I forgive you to the partner who cheated on me, it means that he gets whatever he wants.
Yeah. And then we all have to shut it down, and we never, continue to talk about it.
Yeah. So I actually like kind of where you went with it at the beginning. If we went, no, forgiveness is just maybe releasing your right to exact revenge.
Right. And the person in that example still paid a penalty for that.
So then that means, hey, you still get to set boundaries. You still have to work through communication as a couple.
Mm-hmm. You may not stay married.
Forget. That's a good one too. A belief might mean if I forgive someone, it means I have to stay in the relationship.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that at all. Yeah.
That's probably a really big one for people.
Mm-hmm.
That's a couple big ones, I think. So what does it mean instead? If you are releasing them from that, you can still have boundaries. You still have to work on communication.
You can still make a decision on your relationship.
Well, even like take the pressure off. Like forgiveness doesn't mean you've made a decision one way or the other. I think that's another thing. People are pressured to forgive. They're also pressured to make a choice.
Right.
And it's like, but time and consistency plays so much into that.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't feel consistently safe for a long period of time, how will you ever feel okay saying, I've decided?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, I think you have safety and consistency is like the biggest thing. What else does it allow for you to do?
Healing is it's an individual journey.
Mm-hmm.
And so to some, it could be that next step in moving them closer to healing. It allows you to move forward in your own sphere.
Yeah. I think I would challenge people.
Not a relational sphere.
Right.
Possibly. It depends. There could be an incredibly healing moment there.
So
given the right circumstances.
When I say like it releases your right to exact revenge or whatever, that may also be heard. It's like, well, I don't have a right to be mad if I forgive someone. Mm-hmm. And that's also not true. So again, these are all sort of like conscious or subconscious beliefs around what you might interpret forgiveness as. So just challenge yourself to maybe sit down and define, like, what do you think forgiveness is? And are there conscious or unconscious expectations you associate with that that's then making you feel really uncomfortable about saying the words, I forgive someone? Because then you're really going to identify, okay, is that actually true? Does forgiveness really mean that? And if it doesn't, then you can disconnect that and maybe feel a little more comfortable with it. I'm wondering if anybody listening to this, maybe there's something that we've already said that really hit you on a nervous system level. That's typically like the string,
mm-hmm.
That is plucked. And then you're like, oh, that's the subconscious level. Mm-hmm. We can logically think about all of this, but it's when you sort of have that sensation of, oh, that's it. That's the subconscious speaking. And that's where a lot of this is typically hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And where I think doing some of the deeper work to figure out how, where does that come from and how can I separate that?
Yeah.
The last thing that we're going to talk about that, might kind of hinder forgiveness is a little bit of what I just mentioned. It's the idea that we all have subconscious beliefs that keep us stuck in the past. And when we are stuck in the past, it makes it really difficult to process current events effectively. So actually, I have a personal example that I will vulnerably share. Nobody make fun of me, okay? So Patrick and I were having a conversation last night, and I was I ended up being very emotional about it. And I was like, why in the world am I so emotional about this? Because it was about my desire to be an organized person. So I struggle with keeping the house really organized and like everything put away. I say like we're clean, but messy. That's sort of like, mm-hmm. Right. And so, I want to be an organized person. I want to live in an organized house. I want to know that everything like has its spot and put it back in the spot. But through my whole life, this has been something that I struggle with being able to actually accomplish and then being super consistent with it. So we were having a conversation on that last night, and you made some comments where you were trying really just to kind of help me think it through. You were offering some suggestions of things I might try. And I got really, 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 really really emotional about it. And I was like, why am I so emotional about this? This is ridiculous. The level of emotional response is not
commensurate.
Yeah.
The level of task.
It's not. It shouldn't be associated with the conversation we're having right now. And so the only thing I could come up with was, I think that there's some sort of correlation to, I somehow tie my worth or value, right, to this topic. And where in the world would that come from, except maybe patterns in childhood where I didn't do something well enough and I got in trouble, or there was an expectation that I didn't meet, and around this topic, right? Or a belief that I absorbed about your worthiness means that your worth as a person, or for somebody to come into your house means that you're an organized person, or whatever it is, right? And I haven't necessarily like pinpointed exactly the belief, but I think that's an example of what we're talking about. Something from your past showing up in the future, and you going, wait, like this doesn't make sense for the situation I'm actually in right now. Mm-hmm. This response is like way bigger than what's actually happening right now. That's an example of how something in your nervous system is relating the present experience to something else. And so that's where the subconscious work comes in, because for example, if we were able to figure out the exact belief, or maybe even just the emotion. So maybe it's more just the broad belief that my value is associated with my ability to stay organized. Maybe it's just that.
Yeah.
And so if we were able to process that belief, my brain would take me back to when I started to believe that. We would process that. We would take what we need from it. We'd let that go in the past. Then I would be able to, in our next conversation, just be present in that conversation, not have that level of emotion come up.
Right. Yeah.
So that's just a personal example of how this can show up. But with betrayal and addiction, that can show up in like so many different ways, right? So any time, and this happens a lot in relationships, where when things aren't actually processed and resolved completely in the moment, then when something comes up that hits that emotion or that fear or that insecurity or that belief in a conversation or in an experience or something in your relationship, then a lot of times in conversation, we unconsciously maybe bring up like 10 other things in our relationship where we felt the same. And now we are pulling up all these old experiences and saying, but you did it this time and this time and this time, and see that these all relate. And this is why this is such a problem. And this is why it hurts my feelings, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's an example of how, like, forgiveness, if we're not resolving the issues one at a time, completely, and or if we have such a history of stuff that we're bringing into the current experience, that can really keep us stuck because it's making everything that we're currently dealing with bigger.
Yeah. I was thinking about this, like sometimes, if you're a parent of a child and the child is sneaking cookies and gets caught and the child cries and says, please forgive me. And you go, I forgive you. And probably in that child's case, they're like, yay, no consequences. But you as a parent are going, okay, do I need to lock up the cookies? Do I need to move them somewhere so they're a little bit more inaccessible? There's all these little like offshoots to, even though you did say you forgave, there's all these little offshoots. And that child may feel let off the hook or may not, depending on what their makeup is. But it would be interesting to see, just in a I think a low consequence situation, what negative beliefs can kind of come out of that, or what does that mean to, it actually means different things to, in my small little simple example, it means, the way I describe it, means different things to the two of them. The parent's like, hey, of course I forgive you. We're not going to blow up the house over a cookie, but I'm going to take some additional action. Whereas the kid's like, yay, cool. Where are the cookies? You know what I mean? And maybe not find them. So
maybe not find them.
Yeah, maybe not find them because the parent has taken,
right.
Hey, I've got a kid that likes to steal cookies. You know what I mean? So,
right.
So yeah, but it doesn't, it doesn't take away the fact that in betrayal, you can still forgive your spouse. You can still love your spouse, which you did with me, but also go, hold on a second. I still need to see this. I need to see this. I need to see this. I need to see all of these different things. Yeah.
I think from the betrayed side, from my personal experience, I think I would resonate with if I do X, Y, Z, does it mean I'm letting you off the hook in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That I think would be a big one.
Yeah.
Of like, if I say this, if I do this, does that mean that?
And that's interesting you say that, because you were very deliberate about saying you love me again. You were very deliberate. It's funny. We talked about it earlier in this podcast. I don't remember you saying really that you forgave me, but you were very deliberate in a lot of ways. Very deliberate from an intimacy standpoint. Very deliberate. It wasn't just a woo, yay. Like, you had to see and experience different gates to get to these opportunities for us as a couple to move forward. Mm-hmm. Right? It wasn't just let's just do whatever. Yeah.
I mean? Like what you're saying is like, I didn't say I love you for like 6 months,
right? Because
I needed to kind of process what was happening and get to the point that, for me, I just wasn't going to say that.
Right.
And then same thing with physical intimacy and stuff. And so like we had to hit, and we've talked in depth about that. We had to process a lot of trauma stuff, reestablish safety, emotional connection, safety within intimacy, like all of those kinds of things had to happen over time for me.
Right. Right.
And like I said at the beginning of this podcast, everybody's different.
Everybody has their own path.
For other people, like, that's not as scary a thing as it was for me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's not really anything wrong with that. In fact, there's some ways where I've looked at mine and I'm like, oh man, that took forever.
Of course, and then sometimes you look at somebody like, already? You know what I mean?
There's a balance, right? Yeah. You want to be somewhere in the middle where it's like, I do hold boundaries. I do communicate them clearly. And when we've talked about this, when safety is created, even though it's uncomfortable, I'm going to push myself to move forward. And I think that might be kind of what I'm talking about with the forgiveness area is like, with the intimacy for me, that's a good example. There wasn't necessarily any of those exercises where I was like, yay, let's do the next exercise. This is so comfortable and exciting and fun. No, but I knew that the safety had been created. It was time for the next step, and it was going to lay a foundation for us to continue moving forward. So because of all those things, I would make a decision that it was the right time, and I would follow my intuition and my gut and everything, and I was ready. That's very different than the safety not being established, or maybe having a fear of setting a boundary, right? And so I think sometimes we can stay stuck in the part where, of course, there was fear and insecurity and vulnerability for every single one of those exercises that we did. And I don't want to say easy thing, but the natural thing would be to stay there because you're protected. You're more protected by not moving forward. You're more safe by staying in what you currently know how to manage. That's just the reality of how our brains and our nervous systems work. So to decide to do something new or to step out of your comfort zone, especially after betrayal, will feel scary, even if the partner is doing everything to provide safety for you. So maybe that's an important thing to share, because people might think, well, my partner's doing absolutely everything, and I want to move forward. And I feel like I should be able to move forward, but I'm scared about it. So maybe, is that not the right time? That's only something that you can decide. But what I will tell you is there's never going to be a moving forward that doesn't feel scary.
Right. Yeah.
So just because it's the right decision doesn't necessarily mean that it's the easy one. Ooh, I have another metaphor.
Oh, yeah? Okay, let's hear it.
That was such a smooth intro into this metaphor. I'm so excited. Okay, so I was at a two-day event in Dallas. You know what I'm about to say. All right, so I was at a 2-day event in Dallas, and I was working as an assistant coach there. And this is the people that I did my subconscious reprogramming training work and everything. So that's a lot about what it's focused on, right? It's like, how do you build habits, and how does your brain work, and, understanding the concepts. And so it's a nice little review for me and everything. And so I was in the bathroom one day, and I was sitting on the toilet, and across from the toilet is like that, those shelves, where they put toilet paper and stuff. And I was looking at it, and I was like, oh, there's some that are unwrapped, and there are some that are wrapped, and the branding, and maybe they were 2 different brands, and maybe that's why, but one of them that was wrapped in the thing, the brand was actually the right choice. And I was like, oh, I really want to do a psychological experiment while I'm here. I went over and I stacked up the toilet paper a certain way where there were, on the bottom, there was one that was wrapped and one that was unwrapped. And then on the top, there was one that was wrapped and one that was unwrapped, like alternated. And I was like, okay, now people have the option to choose either one. And I'm just very curious what they're going to choose. And so after the couple of days, I was paying attention throughout the time. And at the end, I was like, oh my gosh, every single time they chose the ones that were unwrapped. Every single time. So what is that? That's the easier choice. Now I know it's toilet paper. It doesn't really matter one way or another, right?
Toilet paper is life.
Right. But it's every single time people chose the easier one. Although I'm trying to think if they would have had to move something to get to. I should have made it like really complicated. But anyway, so there was essentially an even number-ish of both. But they were choosing the ones that were unwrapped. And I just thought that was such a funny metaphor, because at the end, you had all these ones that were sitting there that says right choice, and nobody was choosing the right choice. They were choosing the easy one. But that goes into, smooth transition, that goes into the way our brains are designed.
Right.
It will choose the familiar and every single time because it feels easier. And so part of healing is pushing through. And one of the things that helps us do that is when we are able to say, I know that I am safe and this is scary. but because I am safe, I'm going to move through the fear. And if that feels absolutely impossible, that's where working with a coach, a therapist, a practitioner who can help you identify the underlying beliefs that are keeping you there can be really transformational.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts around forgiveness or any of the things that we've talked about? I just want to reiterate, like, forgiveness is hard.
It is hard.
There's a lot of different definitions and beliefs out there. I would personally challenge you to just think through, like, what is it that you associate with the idea of forgiveness that might be keeping you stuck? And after this type of a conversation, do you think that that's real? Are you able to maybe separate that? Or so much of betrayal recovery, especially if you're choosing reconciliation, is redefining things you had defined before in a different way that makes sense for the place in life that you are right now and the part of your relationship that you're in right now. You redefine your relationship, you redefine anniversaries, you redefine your status as a couple, you redefine all of these things. So maybe what would it be like if you redefined what forgiveness meant? And is there a definition that would make you feel comfortable and safe doing that today?
Well, I think what you highlighted when you extended me forgiveness is you trusted your gut. And so, sometimes your gut can mislead you, but in a lot of cases, especially through this, if the pastor tells you, you need to forgive him, that doesn't feel right. Trust your gut. If you're faced with a situation where you know your spouse and you know how hard they're going to work and all of these different things, and you feel like it's an important part of your healing and maybe relational healing early on, go ahead and extend that forgiveness. But really, really trust your gut there, because I think forgiveness is like it's like an aha moment. Like it strikes at the appropriate time, and only you can define it.
Yeah, and I think going back into, if you're feeling stuck on maybe offering someone forgiveness, maybe don't pressure yourself for sure.
Right.
But maybe go back into the meditation that was the episode right after episode 33 and go through that visualization. It goes through a visualization where you offer yourself forgiveness, which I think you mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast. One of the reasons you think you deleted me forgiving you was because you hadn't forgiven yourself.
Right.
Well, the betrayed partner, like, we can have a lot of frustration with ourselves through this process too. Like, I know I've had a lot of self-frustration of, why can't I do this? Why am I so slow? Why does my brain work like this? What's wrong with me? Right? Like, just a lot of like, this is hard. Why is it hard for me and maybe not somebody else? Right? And so maybe that's something that you are struggling with too. There's a lot of different things that we can maybe offer ourselves forgiveness for. So the first part of the meditation does have you offer yourself forgiveness before extending it to somebody else. So before you actually verbally say it out loud to somebody, that if you're kind of listening to this and you're like, yeah, I'm really struggling, do the meditation first and see how that feels. See if you're able to get through the whole thing and actually offer it to the other person in the visualization first. Or if you notice resistance and then you overcome it through the meditation and get through it. Or if you notice so much resistance that you can't even complete the meditation. And in that scenario, again, I always encourage betrayed partners to work with someone one-on-one, because that's just information. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means that there's more underneath, again, some sort of fear about what forgiveness means, or some sort of belief that is difficult for you to overcome right now. And so if there's so much resistance that you can't get through the visualization, then that's what I would bring to your therapist, practitioner, or coach and say, hey, like, this is what just happened. I tried to do a visualization. These are the emotions that came up. I cannot seem to get through it. And the two of you can work to figure out what is the belief around that, because then you can start to move forward.
Yeah, great.
All right. We hope that this was helpful. We'd love to hear your perspectives on this, your experience, your struggles, your story around this. So if you would like to reach out, just message me on social media. And we are so thankful that you're here, and we will see you next week. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support
find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.